Hey, this is your favorite German compositor, Sebastian Schütt. Welcome back to Split the Diff. It's time for episode 3 of... This episode will be a little bit different. Instead of only looking at one of Nuke's nodes, we will check out a bunch of different tools and techniques that all serve the same purpose: edge extend. This episode will be interesting for artists that haven't heard of this technique before, but also for those who are using it regularly, because edge extend easily turns into one of these techniques that we don't question anymore. There are tons of gizmos out there and they are usually easy to set up, giving us good results right away. But in order to get the shot to 100% and to pass a high-end production quality check, we have to dig a little deeper. There are different approaches and multiple possibilities of adjustments, so we really have to think about what works best for our specific shot. If you haven't yet, please subscribe to my channel and like this video if you've learned something. Tell me about your favorite edge extend tools in the comments below. Please also check out my website splitthediff.com, where I will add some of the setups and tools used in this video at a later time. Now get your seatbelt on. Are you ready? Let's go! Since version 12, Nuke comes with its own edge extend node. Before we will have a look at it, I would like to invite you to a little tour under the hood. We will start off with some background knowledge. Edge extend. What is it and when do we use it? I would think most of us were confronted with the following problem before. We pull a key, copy the alpha into our despilled plate, and after the pre-melt, we end up with a bright or dark edge, mostly in semi-transparent regions. Or we apply a rotomat to our plate to extract an object or person from a plate without a green or blue screen present, and the adjacent plate pixels still poke through our semi-transparent edges. Edge extend comes to the rescue. We take color and texture information from within our shapes and spread them out in order to replace those annoying edges. But I have to warn you, we will always lose some detail. You should always try other approaches first, maybe improve your despill or roto. Sometimes I just keymix in my Dilate result directly with an edge detect in tricky areas, since it does a pretty good job in despilling too. But let's say we tried everything and we decide to go with an edge extend. How do those tools accomplish their results? Well, there are actually multiple different approaches, including some manual treatments. Most of them start the same way. We need to get down to the core of our shape with all the unpolluted color and texture information, usually accomplished by some form of alpha erosion. Now we have the choice. There is the blur Unpremult technique using averaging to spread out pixel values. This usually leads to blurred out information. It's usually a quick, simple and fast approach and works well for soft edges. If you need to maintain sharp details across the edges though, you would want to look into the vector extend approaches. This technique stretches pixels out perpendicular to the surface and maintains details and sharp lines. If you're dealing with streaky but not soft motion blur, that might be a better option. Even if you're dealing with a thin, bright or dark edge, this could be the best way of avoiding a soft rim compared to the blur Unpremult way. Another approach is using an Erode and Dilate combo, which I will explain later more in detail. And finally, we can simply use a brush to smear out pixels exactly the way we need to. This is obviously very time consuming and makes only sense for selective areas, but more to that in a bit. In the end, all these techniques use the original alpha to pre-melt the result, and we hopefully got rid of the ugly edge. And now, follow me on the path under the hood of all these interesting approaches. Let's dissect the blur Unpremult technique. A lot of the edge extend gizmos out there come with at least 2 available inputs, one for your comp and a separate one for your core mat. I will talk about the importance of that in a few minutes. Let me plug in both inputs to the comp for now. We will stay abstract and use the shape so we can really see what's going to happen with our colors as well as texture. As stated before, the first step is always to define your core mat. A lot of gizmos have some properties to adjust the incoming alpha. I first crunch our mat to get rid of the soft edge. In a lot of cases internally, you have a grade node and its black and white points hooked up to those properties. Now I will erode the matte until I get rid of our bright edge. This is what you want. We worked our way towards the pure, unpolluted color and texture information. Now we want to stretch it out beyond the core and into the rest of our original alpha matte. We use a blur node to expand the core colors and texture to pollute the adjacent pixels with those values. By simply blurring the image, we cannot seem to stretch it out that much, but that's only because our alpha values are really low along the edges. The information is there, in the RGB channels. We can solve this by using an Unpremult node. Usually when we premult an image, we want to restrict the available information to the boundaries of the alpha channel. The RGB channels get multiplied with the alpha channel. With the unpremult operation, we divide the barely visible color information by the alpha channel to make it visible again. We now merge our core matte on top to preserve it and maintain our new stretched out areas around it. If we use the original alpha of our shape to pre-multiply our result, we can see that we got rid of the bright edge and replaced it with more valid information. Okay, but what if our bright edge is much thicker? The more we blur our core matte outwards, the more detail gets lost. This is where most of the gizmos come in handy and offer the option of multiple blur unpremult iterations. Let me show you how it looks inside. We have multiple stacks of the blur unpremult bundle, always with the next iteration picking up where the previous one left off. In this example, a switch node is connected to our iteration knob, giving us the amount of slices we ask for. Some gizmos set these stacks up dynamically. As you change the knob value, more stacks get automatically created or deleted again. If we use multiple slices, we should be able to blur the transition line between them a little bit. Some tools offer the option to blur the slices overall too. When we merge our core matte back on top, it also comes in handy if we have a control for softening the transition edge. One big factor that is very important to me is the possibility to split up the knobs in horizontal and vertical directions, as well as having the separate core matte input. I'll show you why with a slightly different shape. Let's assume those bright areas are being caused by keying or rotoscoping the elliptical shape with motion blur. If we now go in and try to edge extend by blurring, we will end up with a blur in all directions, spreading out the color and texture, but not really supporting the direction of the movement. Now it comes in handy if you have the chance to split up the knobs in width and height. You use it to control the direction or angle of the blur and mimic the behavior of the motion blur. If the angle is a bit difficult, you could also use other tricks like rotating the element until the angle becomes more clear, do your extension and then rotate back to the original state. Splitting the knobs is also great for treating your core matte. One axis might need more erosion than the other. This brings us to the importance of an isolated core matte treatment. If I want to get the core of this shape with only erosion, I might risk losing too much plate detail in areas where it's not really necessary to erode that much. The core matte treatment possibilities within the edge extend nodes out there are usually very simple. Especially if you're working on long shots, you want to keep your edge extend treatment as procedural as possible. So you should really spend some time on generating your core matte. Otherwise you'll end up animating knobs in the edge extend tool, losing detail, having to check every frame. So I can't stress this enough. Setting up the core matte brings you already to a very good spot. So in this example here, I do all of my core matte treatment outside the node. You can add all kinds of operations. You can mask and erode or dilate only specific areas. You could even paint on individual frames if needed. You have all the compositing operations available. While you're pretty much restricted to overall black point, white point and erosion, using the internal controls of the edge extend nodes. There are so many possibilities to get to a perfect core mat. I can use an XOR operation, for example, to extract the values that are not 1 or 0, crunch that mat and stencil it from the original alpha. Countless options are available. Another big advantage is that if you need to use another edge extend, same tool or completely different, you already have your core mat set up and ready and just have to plug it in. There's no need to set it up all over again inside the new edge extend node. And look how great this works to preserve the areas that don't need any treatment. Let's have a look at the next edge extend technique. The vector edge extend technique is based on, as the name states, vectors. The approach is to get to know the direction of the pixels, the normals of the shape if you will, and then stretch them out perpendicularly. There are multiple ways to produce some vectors. For example, we can use a filter to edge detect, similar to Nuke's own tool, but instead of the Sobel filter, we use a Char filter. It's a filtering method to identify and highlight gradient edges or features, and it does that in horizontal as well as vertical direction. Another method is to offset the image horizontally and vertically and then subtract the results from the original image. Tools that can deal with vectors are STMap and iDistort, amongst others. I don't want to get too much into STMaps here. There are a couple of great sources out there about this topic, and I'll leave some links in the description of this video. Basically, every pixel of a raw STMap has a unique red and green color value that corresponds to an X and Y coordinate in screen space. Red describes the horizontal axis and green the vertical one. This map can simply be generated by an expression node. We divide every X coordinate with the total width of the image, so we map the coordinates between 0 and 1. We do the exact same thing for Y, the height and the green channel. Since we have to consider the center of a pixel and not the bottom left corner, we have to offset the coordinates by 0.5. If we plug this map into our STMap node, the image stays untouched. As soon as we tweak areas of the map, those adjustments will get mirrored in the actual image. If we now blur and intensify our vector edge detect setup, we can alter this STMap by subtracting the red values and adding the green values. Similar to the expression for the STMap, I also normalize those values so they sit between 0 and 1. The node detects this vector shift and applies it to the image, hence stretching out the edge pixels. Let's bring back our original alpha to pre-multiply the result, and we end up with our edge fixed. I also mentioned the iDistort node. In that case, we also blur and multiply our vector edge detect values and shuffle them into our B-pipe. We then use those channels to drive the iDistort. The multiplier controls the strength of the distortion, while the blur node helps us to smooth out the transition between core mat and edge treatment. Both are very interesting techniques. Later on, I will talk about advantages and disadvantages of using the different edge extend techniques, but first we will have a look at the remaining approaches. The Erode Dilate technique is quickly set up. We connect two nodes with the same filter algorithm via expression, with the second node performing the inverse operation. That way we make sure that we end up with the same alpha mat as before the erosion. The image gets eroded in using some form of filtering or averaging that hopefully gets rid of our discrepancies that are not part of the rest of the image. Then it gets dilated back out with the edge information long gone. Of course, you can also split the knobs to treat every axis just as much as needed. I also added a grade node to compensate for the change in brightness caused by the averaging process. Obviously, the image itself gets altered overall, so we have to make sure to only use the information we need to kill off that bright edge. In this case, I'm using an edge detect and merged our result back on top of the original image, making sure it only affects the outside of our shape. Interesting here is that we can play around with and use any type of operation to merge those two inputs. Since we're dealing with a bright edge here, I decided to use the min operation, which makes sure that only the lowest pixel values, either of the B or A input, will get passed through. This makes sure that we get rid of high values like the bright edge, but we keep other darker details that might not be affected so much by it. We can achieve another form of dilating by using the level set node. This node outputs the distance from a pixel in the viewer to the nearest pixel in the input channel of your choice. So it calculates vectors for us. And it also includes a dilate feature. It delivers high quality or precise results, but can also be very slow to process. Let's have a look at the last edge extend technique. The following technique should only be considered for specific areas. Either there are only a few edge areas that you have to fix, or you need to stay in complete control of how those pixels get stretched out. Just pop in Erode paint, InPaint, or other node of your choice that can help you to manually smear out pixels. Adding a few simple paint strokes can work much better than setting up and tweaking a proper edge extend approach. See how I am in control of every bit of direction? This can get quite heavy, of course, if you're using a lot of strokes on a lot of frames, so this should only be your choice if it is quicker than any other approach or if you need to have full control. One thing to be considered for your setup is if you need multiple edge extend nodes for different areas, or if you can do those tweaks within the core mat and stick with only one node. In this example here, you can nicely see how all the colors bleed into another. But maybe that's not what you want. If you would like to contain certain areas, you could tweak the core mat in order to prevent them from bleeding outwards too much. If we do it for this section too, and then keymix the result, we are more in control of the color bleed. In this case, it comes in handy if your edge extend tool of choice gives you the option to output the blurred content only, and you merge the core back on top yourself. If it would be enough to only get rid of the green color bleed, you could also do your tweaks in the core mat only and stick with one edge extend node. This example is to trigger your brain a little bit to think about it more consciously. All the approaches I talked about have one thing in common. We will lose some plate detail. By eroding into it and softening transition lines, we cannot avoid it. But we can try to restore as much detail as possible. I'll show you an interesting way to accomplish that. I would like to extract the high frequency detail of this image. This can usually be done by blurring the image slightly, so we get rid of fine detail, and then comparing it to the original image. In this case, we use division. See how I can adjust the threshold by blurring more or less. We know that the inverse operation of division is multiplication. If I now multiply the blurred image with the isolated detail, I'm back at my original plate. So how is this information useful for our edge extend approaches? Well, as we know now, in most cases we accomplish the extension of pixel values by averaging or blurring the content. Similar to multiplying our blurred plate version here, we can now use the same technique and multiply our blurred edges with the isolated detail in order to restore it. Here's another good example of how this helps us to restore some of the fine hair detail. And I'm not talking about the alpha channel, but more about the small changes in detail in color values and contrast. And we are back at Nuke's Edge Extend tool. Let's see what it has to offer. First thing that pops up and is already a big advantage is the GPU acceleration. There's only one slider to adjust or create your core mat, but as we've seen earlier, it makes more sense to create the core mat outside the tool anyways. I don't know the exact algorithm the node uses, but it definitely looks like a blur unpremult approach. The tool takes the whole frame dimensions as the fill region into account, meaning you don't have to deal with adjusting the blur width. But this way you're not having any control about slices or blur amount. You also cannot split up knobs and change blur directions. A great add-on is the option to restore high frequency detail, as well as outputting an edge mat for further treatments. The node works out of the box, but has a lot of restrictions regarding manual tweaks. Let's have a look at some other tools that are out there to get a feeling of what they offer, what you need to look out for, and what's missing. I will also leave links to their NUKEPEDIA pages in the description below. This selection of nodes is quite random. My intention is to trigger your brain a little bit and show you different ideas. The first one up is color dilate. I've seen this node in a lot of companies being used on a lot of projects. It's pretty straightforward, offers a separate core mat input, and allows quite a bit of manual treatment. You can split some knobs, but it can break internal links since some of the tools inside expect one connected link and not two. So always double check and have a look inside if everything works as expected. This is a general note. This is also a good example for a tool that creates iterations or slices dynamically. The downside can be that it runs a Python script every time I change any knob or move the node, in order to check if the user changed the number of iterations. The next node is called edge. The amount of inputs seems a bit much, but it can be very useful. Imagine you have the plate on its own. You are provided with an alpha from a key or roto, plus you have a separate stream for your core mat adjustments. This tool goes to the next level by even providing blending options if you plug in the background you're intending to use it with. It helps you to blend and scatter colors across the edges. You can output the merged result or bake in the edge blending tweaks and merge it later. Edge also gives you the chance to preview your edge mat, create a channel for it, and the option to extend chroma only. There's a lot to play around with. PXF filler is meant to be used to fill holes, so if you want to use it on the outside of your shape instead, you'll have to invert your core mat before it goes in the whole mask. An interesting option here is the presence of a rotation knob, so you don't have to tweak the size, width and height knobs too much to get your angle right. Kill Outline is also quick and simple to set up and reuses the good old original Edge Extend by Frank Rüther. Unfortunately, most of the knobs cannot be split up. You have control over slice iterations, width and size, as well as transition edge treatments. GS Edge Extend is interesting as it uses either an Erode filter or a ST-map to stretch out pixels. Also, you can semi-dynamically change the amount of iterations, but instead of having a Python script running in the background all the time as seen before, you can change it by clicking the button and only then a script will run. JK UV Edge Extend also uses ST-maps to stretch out pixels. What's interesting with this tool is that it gives you the chance to restore dark or bright detail individually. This is being achieved by using min and max operations inside the gizmo. PXF Distort uses an iDistort under the hood. The great thing is that you have several filters to choose from. Please just watch out for artifacts that might be a byproduct of certain filter operations. You might want to use it in log space then. Vector Extend Edge is based on the blur Unpremult technique but takes advantage of using vector blur nodes instead of regular blur nodes. So it's a bit of a hybrid. Vector Edge Extend lets you choose between iDistort or ST-map approach. And Edge Expand by SpinVFX offers you the full package of all techniques. That's a great way of testing out which approach works best for your situation. It's time for a summary. First, see what else you can improve before dropping in an edge extend. Most likely we will risk losing some plate detail. Do some tests to figure out which technique works best for your situation. What are the characteristics of those edge areas you are trying to replace? Is it mostly softness or a lot of sharp detail? Make sure to know if your tool of choice expects a pre-multed or unpremulted image. Take your time to establish a core mat that lets your edge extend tool work as procedural as possible. You don't want to animate or tweak too much within the tool, frame by frame. Think about if you really need to use multiple edge extends and keymix them, or if you can actually make the necessary tweak within the core mat and stick with only one edge extend node. Finally, try everything you can to preserve or restore lost plate detail. This brings today's episode to an end. Thanks for watching and thank you very much for being a part of the Split the Diff community. My name is Sebastian Schütt and I'll see you soon.